1820. That is the year they tell us Antarctica was first sighted. First officially sighted, they'll clarify that if you press them. First documented, first recorded, first entered into the formal ledger of human exploration. For most of my life, I accepted that without resistance. It's the kind of fact that arrives pre-digested. You don't engage with it. You absorb it, the way you absorb a street name or a capital city passively, without asking what was there before the name was given. But then I started looking at the gap. Not the continent, not the ice, the gap. The 4 years between 1816 and 1820, and once I started looking at it, I found I couldn't look away. Before I go further, I need to return briefly to the foundation I laid in the previous video in this series, because what follows will not carry its full weight without it. If you haven't seen that episode, I'll link it below. In it, I examined what mainstream history presents as the year without a summer, 1816. The year the official record tells us that the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia ejected sufficient particulate matter into the upper atmosphere to suppress global temperatures, collapse harvests across the northern hemisphere, and transform summer into something the people living through it had no name for. A single Indonesian volcano. The explanation is clean. The causation is linear. It fits inside a textbook paragraph without friction. But here is where I want to be precise, because the official account contains a detail that I don't think receives the weight it deserves. The collapse was not regional. The crop failures, the unnatural cold, the reports of skis turned the color of ash and sulfur. They were not clustered near Indonesia or even near the Pacific. They were simultaneous, continent-spanning, and not only environmentally. In the years immediately following 1816, something else happened, something that sits just beneath the surface of the historical record. A cascade of institutional ruptures, population displacements at a scale that doesn't map cleanly onto a volcanic winter. What one historian I came across described, very carefully, as civilizational discontinuity. Communities that appear to lose their thread with what came before. A before and an after with almost nothing visible in the seam between them. In that video, I suggested that the year without a summer may not have been only a volcanic event. I want to hold that suggestion here, and I want to place something next to it. 4 years after 1816, 48 months, no more 3 separate nations claimed to sight Antarctica for the first time. The British, the Americans, the Russians, independently, within the same narrow window of months. The largest landmass on Earth, absent from 10,000 years of maritime ambition, surfaces officially in the historical record less than half a decade after the world's atmosphere collapsed. I'm not going to tell you what that means. Not yet. I want you to hold the proximity. The number 1816, the number 1820, the gap between them. Because I've been sitting with those two numbers for a long time now, and the more I've examined what falls inside that gap, what was lost, what was renamed, what was frozen, the more I've come to believe that the story we've been given about the bottom of the world is not the story of a discovery. It may be the story of a burial. Let me begin with what the official record actually says, because I think it deserves a fair hearing before we examine where it stops being sufficient. April 10, 1815. Mount Tambora on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa erupts with a force estimated at roughly 160 cubic kilometers of displaced material, the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history. The ash column reaches an altitude of approximately 43 kilometers. The death toll in the immediate region is somewhere between 70,000 and 90,000 people. The official account then traces a clean arc from that single event to the global cooling of 1816. Particulate matter suspended in the upper atmosphere, solar radiation partially blocked, temperatures suppressed, harvests fail, famine follows, one cause, one effect. The explanation is not unreasonable. Volcanic winters are documented phenomena. I want to be clear about that. But here is where I need to ask you to slow down with me. Because the scale of what happened in 1816 has a shape to it that I've spent a long time trying to reconcile with a single Indonesian volcano. The documented temperature drop across the northern hemisphere averaged somewhere between 0.4 and 0.7 degrees Celsius. That number sounds modest. It was not modest in its consequences. Snow fell in New England in June. Frost killed crops in Pennsylvania in July and August. In parts of France and Germany, the grain harvest failed so completely that bread riots broke out in cities that had not seen bread riots in living memory. In China, monsoon patterns shifted. In India, a weakened monsoon season is now linked by some researchers to a mutation in the cholera bacterium that produced the first modern pandemic. Hold that detail. We'll return to the geographic reach of this event. Because here is what I cannot reconcile with the Tambora explanation. The uniformity, not just the temperature drop, the texture of what people described. Across accounts from observers in North America, Western Europe, Scandinavia, and parts of Asia, there is a recurring description that I find difficult to file under volcanic ash. Orange and purple sunsets of unusual intensity. A persistent dry fog that did not behave like weather. A quality of light that multiple independent witnesses described as wrong. One letter I came across, written by a farmer in Vermont in the summer of 1816, described the sky as looking, and I want to quote this carefully, as though the sun had been replaced with something that only resembled it. I'm not saying that letter is evidence. I'm saying it belongs to a pattern of phenomenological description that cluster around this event from sources that had no contact with each other. And the pattern does not read like a regional ash cloud diffusing outward from Indonesia. It reads like something that arrived everywhere at once. Let me say that again more carefully. The experiential record of 1816, not the temperature data, but the first-hand written accounts of what people saw and felt, suggests a simultaneity that a single-point volcanic source struggles to fully explain. Regional volcanic winters have been documented before and since. They have directional signatures. They intensify near the eruption site and attenuate with distance. 1816 does not appear to attenuate. What it appears to do is reset. And that word, reset, is one I want to hold very lightly because I'm aware of how much weight it carries. But the institutional record of the years immediately following 1816 contains something that I think deserves far more scrutiny than it has received. The population displacements across the northeastern United States and Western Europe during this window don't track cleanly with famine migration patterns. Famine displaces people toward food sources, toward cities, toward coasts. What the census and parish records from this period show in certain regions is something closer to wholesale community discontinuity. Villages that had maintained unbroken records for generations producing gaps. Administrative structures that appear to restart rather than recover. A before and an after with almost no visible connective tissue. I don't know what caused that. I want to be honest about what I don't know. But I know that the Tambora explanation was already being questioned by researchers well outside the alternative history space, climatologists and historians who found the global uniformity of 1816 difficult to account for with a single equatorial eruption. Which brings me to the question I've been building toward, the one that pulled me into the next phase of this investigation. If 1816 was the signature of something larger, a terminal event, a civilizational punctuation mark, then what was it punctuating? What existed immediately before that gap in the record? What kind of world produces that quality of institutional amnesia and then, 48 months later, officially discovers an entire continent? That is the question I am going to answer, and the answer starts not with ice. It starts with buildings, specific buildings in specific places that should not exist. That question, what existed before the gap, is where I need to introduce a name. And I want to be careful about how I introduce it because it carries associations that have made serious researchers reluctant to touch it. The name is Tartaria. On maps produced between the 14th and 18th centuries, maps issued by European cartographic institutions that had no coordinated reason to agree on a fiction. There appears a vast territorial designation spanning from Eastern Europe across Central Asia to the Pacific coast. Tartaria, not a vague ethnic label, a named, bordered, administratively recognized civilization. It appears on maps by Mercator, by Bliu, by Hondius. It persists across 2 centuries of European cartography, and then, in the early 19th century, it quietly disappears from the record. Not through conquest, not through a documented dissolution. It simply stops being named. I want to be precise about what I'm not claiming. I'm not claiming Tartaria was a secret empire that mainstream history suppressed overnight. What I'm saying is that the cartographic record contains an entity of significant geographic scale that receives almost no institutional attention relative to its documented presence, and that its disappearance from the naming conventions of world maps coincides with uncomfortable proximity to the post-1816 period. But the maps are not the strangest part. The strangest part is the buildings. Across the American frontier, in cities that were supposedly raw settlements built by pioneers with hand tools in the mid-19th century, there exist civic structures of a scale and ornamental complexity that does not belong to the story we've been told. Hold that observation, because the question of who built them, and how, and with what institutional knowledge, is one this investigation will return to with specific examples. If you're finding this investigation worth your time, consider subscribing. This series goes places most channels won't touch. Now, back to the buildings, because what they suggest about the world before 1816 changes everything that comes after. So let me return to 1820, because now that we've established what may have existed before the gap, the timing of Antarctica's official discovery becomes a different kind of problem. The standard account presents 3 independent discoveries as a remarkable coincidence of the age of exploration. Edward Bransfield, sailing for the British Royal Navy, sights the Antarctic Peninsula in January of 1820. Fabian von Bellingshausen, commanding a Russian imperial expedition, records his own sighting that same month. Nathaniel Palmer, an American sealing captain, follows within the year. 3 nations, 3 separate voyages, no shared itinerary. No coordinated departure. All arriving at the same previously uncharted continent within months of each other, after 10 millennia of maritime civilization had somehow failed to notice it. Let me say that more slowly. 10,000 years of seafaring humanity, Phoenicians, Polynesians, Chinese admirals, Portuguese explorers who mapped coastlines with extraordinary precision, and not one of them produces a verified, officially recognized sighting of a landmass larger than Europe. Then, in a single 12-month window, 3 rival empires find it simultaneously. The official explanation is that improved shipbuilding and navigation finally made southern latitudes accessible. I want to be fair to that explanation. It is not unreasonable on its surface, but it does not explain the synchronization. Improved technology diffuses gradually. It does not produce a single concentrated window of simultaneous arrival by parties with competing national interests and no shared communication. I'm not saying they were coordinated. I'm asking what would have to be true for this to be coincidence. And I'm asking why the window is 1820, not 1800, not 1840, 1820, 4 years after the reset. Hold that question, because the answer may already exist in a map drawn 3 centuries earlier by an Ottoman admiral who should not have had it. The map was drawn in 1513. Its author was Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral, a cartographer of considerable reputation, a man who was meticulous enough about his sources that he documented them in his own marginal notes. He states explicitly that the map was compiled from older source maps, some of which he attributes to the era of Alexander the Great. I want to be careful here because that attribution is contested. What is not contested is the map itself. It exists. It has been examined by cartographers, historians, and in 1960, by a professor of history at Georgetown University named Charles Hapgood, whose analysis I'll return to in a moment. What the Peary Rise map shows in its lower portion is a landmass that was not supposed to exist in 1513, a continuous coastline running along the southern edge of the known world, curving in a configuration that subsequent researchers have argued corresponds, with uncomfortable accuracy, to the subglacial coastline of Antarctica, not the ice shelf, the rock beneath it. The mainstream response to this is that the landmass is a misidentification, a distorted representation of South America, or a theoretical southern continent that medieval cartographers invented to balance the globe's proportions. I want to give that explanation its full weight because it is not unreasonable. Speculative southern continents do appear on earlier maps. But then Hapgood submitted the Peary Rise map to cartographic analysis using modern coordinate systems. His findings suggested the coastline was drawn using a projection centered not on the Mediterranean, but on a point that corresponds to the intersection of the Tropic of Capricorn and the Prime Meridian, a technically sophisticated projection. For 1513. Let me say that plainly. The map may reflect not imagination but memory. And 18 years after Peary Rise, another cartographer named Orontius Phineus drew something that should have been impossible, something that takes this from anomaly to pattern. Orontius Phineus was a French cartographer working in Paris. In 1531, he produced a world map that was considered accomplished enough to be included in a prestigious Parisian atlas of the period. In the center of that map sits a heart-shaped projection of the known world, and at its southern pole, rendered with rivers, mountain ranges, and what appear to be coastal inlets, sits a continent, not a speculative smear. A detailed landmass with interior geography, positioned where Antarctica is. The mainstream response is familiar: theoretical continent, cartographic convention, educated speculation. And again, I want to be fair. Speculation existed, but speculation produces generalized shapes. It does not produce specific mountain ranges. In 1958 and 1959, during the International Geophysical Year, scientists used seismic sounding technology, equipment that did not exist in any form before the 20th century, to map the subglacial topography of Antarctica for the first time. The rock beneath 2 miles of ice. What they found, when Hapgood and his cartographic team later overlaid those results onto the Phineus map, was a correspondence that I have spent considerable time trying to explain away. The mountain ranges Phineus drew in the interior of his southern continent align, in their general position and orientation, with subglacial features that no human eye had seen since, if the mainstream timeline is correct, before recorded history. Let me say that as precisely as I can. The guesswork explanation requires us to accept that a 16th century Parisian cartographer, speculating about a continent no one had visited, accidentally guessed the correct position of mountain ranges that were buried under ice and invisible to science until 1958. That is not guesswork. That is either the most extraordinary coincidence in the history of cartography, or it is something else entirely. And if it is something else, if Phineus, like Peary Rise, was working from source material that preserved a memory of an ice-free Antarctica, then the question that follows is immediate and unavoidable. When did the ice arrive? And what was there before it? The mainstream geological position is that Antarctica has been substantially ice-covered for approximately 34 million years. I want to state that clearly, because it is the established scientific consensus, and I have no interest in dismissing it carelessly. The broad glaciation of the continent is not in dispute. What this investigation is concerned with is something narrower and more specific: the question of whether the ice sheet has been stable and uniform across that entire span, or whether it has retreated and advanced in ways that the official timeline does not fully account for. Because there is evidence, peer-reviewed, institutionally published evidence, that portions of Antarctica were significantly less ice-covered during periods within the last several thousand years. Core samples extracted from the Ross Sea show sediment layers that some researchers have interpreted as evidence of seasonal meltwater rivers as recently as 6,000 years ago. Hold that figure. 6,000 years is not the deep geological past. It is within the range of human civilization. Now place that alongside 1816, a sudden, global, high-energy atmospheric event of unusual uniformity. An event that, whatever its cause, would have introduced an extraordinary volume of particulate matter and thermal disruption into the planetary system. I want to be careful here, because I am not a climate scientist, and I am not claiming a direct causal mechanism. What I am suggesting is that the question deserves to be asked. Could a sufficiently energetic atmospheric event, arriving at a moment when polar ice was already reduced, have triggered a rapid and irreversible advance of glaciation at the southern pole? Not over millions of years, over decades, perhaps less. The ice we now call permanent may not have always been permanent. It may be a seal, applied suddenly. And if that's what happened in the years around 1816, then the three nations who arrived at its edge 4 years later weren't discovering a new world. They were arriving at a crime scene, and someone had already been there before them. Someone had already been there, and I want to examine who went looking and why and what they may have found. In 1938, Nazi Germany dispatched an expedition to Antarctica under the command of Alfred Richer. The official purpose was territorial claim, to establish a German presence in a region they designated Neuschwabenland. The expedition used the vessel Schwabenland, conducted aerial surveys over approximately 600,000 square kilometers of interior territory, and dropped metal swastika markers to assert sovereignty. The official record presents this as routine imperial ambition. I want to be fair to that framing. Territorial expansion was a documented German priority in this period. But I want to be precise about the scale. This was not a flag-planting exercise. The aerial survey of 600,000 square kilometers of Antarctic interior in 1938, using seaplane technology launched from a ship in polar waters, represented an extraordinary investment of logistical resources for a nation already mobilizing for war. You do not allocate that kind of operational capacity for a symbolic gesture. Hold that observation, because 8 years later, the United States did something even harder to explain. In 1946, Rear Admiral Richard Byard led Operation High Jump to Antarctica. 13 ships, 33 aircraft, nearly 5,000 men. The largest military expedition ever mounted to the continent, dispatched less than a year after the end of World War II. When American military resources were already stretched across a shattered world. The official designation was scientific research. The operation was structured, commanded, and supplied like a combat deployment. It was abruptly curtailed after 8 weeks. The stated reasons were logistical. The records of what the aerial surveys found in the interior were classified. 2 nations, no shared ideology, no coordinated objective, both sending military forces, not scientists, to the same ice, both returning with incomplete public records. If these patterns are raising questions you haven't seen raised elsewhere, consider sharing this work. The deeper the scrutiny reaches, the harder it becomes to ignore. Now, back to the ice, because what happened next suggests that whatever they found, someone made very certain it would stay found by no one else. 13 years after Operation High Jump, the world's nations signed the Antarctic Treaty. I want to walk through what that treaty actually requires, because I think the summary version most people carry understates what happened. The treaty was signed in Washington on December 1, 1959, by 12 original nations. The United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, Australia, Norway, Argentina, Chile, Belgium, Japan, New Zealand, and South Africa. It established Antarctica as a continent reserved exclusively for peaceful scientific research. It prohibited military installations, weapons testing, and nuclear activity. It suspended all existing territorial claims and prohibited new ones. It required that all scientific observations and results be freely exchanged. And it established an inspection regime allowing any signatory to examine any other signatory's Antarctic facilities without prior notice. The official framing is that this was a triumph of Cold War diplomacy, a rare moment when ideological rivals chose cooperation over competition. I want to be fair to that framing. It is not entirely without merit. But let me say this slowly. The United States and the Soviet Union in 1959 could not agree on Berlin, on Korea, on nuclear testing, on trade, on the structure of the United Nations, or on virtually any question of shared governance anywhere on Earth. They were building weapons specifically designed to destroy each other's cities. And yet, on the question of Antarctica, a continent officially described as containing nothing of strategic or economic value, they achieved not just agreement, but a level of coordinated access restriction that has expanded continuously for 65 years and now includes over 50 nations. Nations that share no ideology, no alliance, no history of cooperation, all maintaining the same category of silence about the same landmass. I'm not saying they're hiding the same thing. I'm asking what kind of thing, once seen, produces that quality of unanimous agreement to look away. The answer may depend on who was watching before any of them arrived, and that question has a name I haven't yet fully addressed. The name I haven't fully addressed is the one this entire investigation has been circling, Tartaria, and the question it forces, the one I find most difficult to sit with, is not whether it existed. The cartographic record suggests it did in some form at some scale. The question is where its records went. Every advanced civilization produces documentation. Administrative records, architectural plans, geographic surveys, accumulated scientific knowledge. The Roman Empire left libraries. The Ottoman Empire left archives. The Mongol Empire, for all its violence, left administrative records of extraordinary detail. Civilizational collapse does not erase documentation. It displaces it, buries it, moves it somewhere. Now hold two things simultaneously. First, the Piri-Reis map of 1513 and the Phineas map of 1531 both show an ice-free Antarctica with interior geographic detail that was not confirmed until 1958. Someone gave those cartographers source material. That source material came from somewhere. It was preserved through whatever event or transition separated the old world from the world that followed it. Someone carried it forward. Second, the continent those maps depict is currently sealed under approximately 2 miles of ice, governed by a treaty that 50 nations maintain with a unanimity they cannot achieve on any other subject on Earth, and surveyed by military expeditions whose interior findings were classified. Let me say what the pattern suggests, as carefully as I can. If Tartaria possessed the geographic and scientific knowledge reflected in those maps, knowledge of subglacial terrain, of polar coastlines, of a continental interior, then its archive would represent the most significant body of suppressed human knowledge in existence. And if that archive was physically located on a continent that was subsequently sealed by ice and locked behind an international treaty, then we are not looking at a coincidence of circumstances. We may be looking at a designed outcome. And someone designed it, which means someone knew what was there, which means the question isn't whether the knowledge survived. The question is who has always known where it is. I want to try to say what this investigation has shown, not as a series of claims, but as a shape, because that is the only honest way I know how to close it. A civilization appears on European maps for 4 centuries, and then vanishes from the record without a documented dissolution. A global atmospheric event of unusual uniformity strikes in 1816, producing not just climate collapse but institutional discontinuity across multiple continents simultaneously. 4 years later, three rival empires discover the same landmass within months of each other. That landmass had been drawn, with subglacial accuracy, by cartographers working 3 centuries earlier from source maps of unknown origin. The continent was subsequently surveyed by two separate military powers who classified their interior findings. Then 50 nations, nations that could not agree on anything else, agreed in perpetuity to restrict access to it. And somewhere beneath 2 miles of ice, in a place that human beings have been drawing from memory since before the age of exploration, something is preserved that we have not been permitted to examine. That is the shape. I want to be honest that I cannot fill it with certainty. I don't have the answer. I don't know what is under the ice. I don't know who designed the suppression, if suppression is the correct word, or when the decision was made, or whether anyone alive today is fully aware of what they are guarding. I have spent a long time with this material, and what I have arrived at is not a conclusion. It is a recognition. The cartographic record knew before the explorers arrived. The explorers arrived immediately after the reset. The military arrived before the treaty. The treaty arrived before the science. Every official sequence, when examined closely, appears to run in the wrong order for a story about discovery. It runs in the correct order for a story about management. Once you see that, I have found it very difficult to unsee. The next video goes somewhere I wasn't sure I was ready to go. It concerns who the custodians of the source maps may have been, the specific institutional lineage that carried Tartarian geographic knowledge from the pre-1816 world into the hands of Ottoman admirals and French cartographers. I think I am ready now. I wasn't, for a long time. The thread leads somewhere that changes the shape of everything above it, not just this investigation, but the structure of institutional knowledge itself. If this series has been worth something to you, I'd ask you to leave your thoughts below. Not just reactions, theories, observations, things you've noticed that I haven't addressed. This investigation is not finished, and I don't think it belongs only to me. 1820. They told us that was the year it was found. I think it was the year they decided we were ready to be told it existed.